So autoloading in namespaces, this is a concept to that are related to object-oriented programming in general. We're still not at specifically about Drupal stuff yet, but this can apply. These concepts can apply to definitely any PHP project, and most likely to any object-oriented project, because the concepts are generic that solve common problems. So here's what we're going to cover. We're going to talk about autoloading, which is configuring PHP to automatically include class files for you. Namespaces, which is another level of encapsulation, which group related classes together. PSR4, which is a standard in PHP for autoloading, and then using Composer for autoloading. So the very first thing is, what is autoloading and what problem does it solve? Well, consider a complicated system, and you've written 1,000 classes that make up this system. Say it's for coordinating flights across the world. So how do you make sure that all your class files are loaded everywhere you need them? Do you require 1,000 classes in every single file throughout your system? No, you don't. So instead, what we want to do is we want to configure PHP to automatically go get a class file and require it the moment we instantiate it for the first time. And that concept is autoloading. And here's how we do it. So we write a function that goes and looks for a file by class name. And if it's found, we require that file. And then we register with a PHP, this is a built-in to PHP, SPL autoload register. We register our function with PHP. And this way, anytime that we instantiate a class, in this example, if that class exists in the includes folder under the file name class.php, then it'll automatically be included. So let's walk through an example of if we have, well, actually, let me just skip that because here's a better. Okay, now let's walk through an example where we've got our class called Black Bear. We're going to create a new instance of Black Bear. So what happens is PHP says, okay, I don't have a class named Black Bear already, so let's go through all the registered autoloader functions and see if the result is we can find that class. So it eventually hits our autoloader. Our autoloader says, is there a file in the includes directory called blackbear.php? If so, require that file. And now, seamlessly, I continue using a class without ever explicitly requiring its one file. So it has automatically loaded the class file.
You can question your classes always called the same thing as the file.
Not always in every system, but ideally, yes. And we're going to work towards that when we talk about PSR4. So the world becomes, if your class name does not match its file name, your job is much harder. You've made life hard for no real value. And I think we'll see that. And I think we'll see that probably about 8 slides from now. Yes, this will automatically load interfaces also. Okay, so let's talk about namespaces. And then we're going to glue these concepts together. So namespaces are a way to encapsulate classes together, or really anything, but generally it's going to be used for classes. Classes together in a way to where it says that these classes are all representative of this concept, which is the namespace. Boy, did I get more vague as that sentence went along? I think I just undescribed that. Okay, a good way to think about a namespace is like a file system, and that becomes very practical when we talk about PSR4. So if you have a bunch of classes in one folder, or you got a bunch of files in one folder, you could say that that folder is sort of the namespace for those files. that folder encapsulates all those files together. And we can actually write that out in PHP. And it's done by using the keyword namespace at the top of the class file. So I've created a new class, apparently called object, and I've said that this object exists within the namespace example. So that later when I'm using this specific object, I'll instantiate it by saying new example, its namespace, object, its class name. And this is how you define it. And so if I had a completely different class in a different file that I thought belonged to the same sort of example set of classes, in that other class, I would write namespace example at the top. And now that has related those things together, those classes together. So, I mean, this is basic. Let's talk about why. All right. So, what problem do they solve? So, if you go way back in time in PHP, let's say a dozen years, before namespaces existed, and then you look at a complicated system, you're going to find a whole bunch of classes named stuff like this. And that is because you can't have two classes of the same name, so to avoid classes conflicting with each other, people just kept adding more and more prefixes to the class. So the problem is when you have a complicated system without namespaces, you end up with very long class names that just sort of become not valuable and downright cumbersome when you have to start using those later in your system. Like, do you want to instantiate 24 classes named that sort of thing? Nobody does. So instead, what we do is we namespaces our class to sort of simplify how it's used later by the system, which will be more obvious next slide, I promise. So instead of this a whole bunch of underscore prefix stuff, we namespace the class and we access it like this. And now we can all ask the question, but is that better? And the answer is not yet, but it will be next slide. Because, you know, those are roughly the same length. But using the namespace concept allows us to make use of the greater namespace, I guess, sort of system and ideas, which is not only can you define things by not only can you define sort of the structure in which they are encapsulated, like in a folder concept, but you can import entire folders into other files. And you do that with the use keyword. So the idea here is that we're somewhere else in the system, and we need to access a whole bunch of classes within this part of the system that belong elsewhere. And we don't want to write their fully namespace class name all the time. So what we do is at the top of our file, we say use the full class namespace, and now we can just call it by its class as we need it. So what we need here, ideally, is an example that involves many more uses here. But so up here, I open PHP. I say I'm going to use every single fully namespace class, and then I can just instantiate them with their tiny class name, their relative class name, as many times as I want.
If you've got two conflict classes that are in the same, they're using two different namespaces, and each namespace has
Yeah. So if we had a different class, and I should have totally made a slide for this, you can alias classes. And so say I had a different class called conflicts, and it was in the folder some other long class name to avoid conflicts. Then I have two classes that are supposedly named conflicts, and they're going to have trouble. But what I can do is I can say use some really long class name to avoid conflicts as some other word, and I've created an alias for this class. And I'll somebody remind me, and when we get into PHP land, I'll write that example out because aliases are useful. Okay, so the syntax. If we follow along with that file folders analogy, then the syntax is that from a global perspective, without importing anything, we have to start at the root level. So we start with a slash. And alternatively, if we're already within a folder, if we're using, if we've imported files into the current, if we've imported the namespace into the current file, then we don't need to start with that /. So like a file system, that first slash means start at the global scope, accessing classes. And without the slash, that means within the current scope and everything else that has been imported into the current scope. Yes?
The namespace is complex. Can you go back to the file, to the code where that namespace is ends with to avoid?
Yes. So,
so would you use that namespace, or would you say use the namespace / class?
you can do either. So the namespace doesn't include the class name. But later, when you choose to use something, you could use just this top level folder. You could import, so use to avoid. But in doing so, you'd have to start here by saying new to avoid conflicts. To actually be able to access this class, I don't like my examples. To be able to actually use this class named conflicts directly without that sort of prefix, without any other structural prefix, you import the class itself, fully namespace to the class, and now that class is there. But you could actually just import a folder, but then you have to tell each instance, or each time you instantiate, you have to say new folder name class, folder name conflicts. And I'm using the word folder name to sort of keep that idea simple and relevant when we get to PSR4. Okay, so you got global if you're starting at the top. You start with the slash. If you're relative, you meaning within the current context or scope, you don't have a slash. Okay, so here we are, another example. Okay, so my app has a templating engine that's made up of a whole bunch of different classes, specifically a file loader and a renderer. And so here, where I'm actually going to output a rendered template, we'll say this is index.php. So I import both of these classes by name, by fully namespace, my app template engine loader, and use my app template engine renderer. And now I can just access those classes directly throughout the rest of the script. Yes, so they're relative to what was brought in here. If this example said use my app template engine, just that one, then here relative I would have to sort of start at that last item, that last folder, and say new template engine loader, new template engine renderer. Okay, so the idea of namespaces is to keep related classes together. And what you want to do with namespaces is make your namespace match a folder structure within your extension or app. And that's where we get to PSR4, which stands for PHP Standard Recommendation number 4. And basically, this is the standard that all of the sort of composer land contributed PHP packages adhere to, ideally, so that they all work together easily. And what this standard says is that our namespace will match our folder structure. And that's why the analogy is very valuable. So if I have a class under this namespace, template engine loader, my app template engine loader, then it must live within a folder called my app, within a folder called template engine, and its class and file name must be loader. This is PSR4. So how does it work? All right. So here's another simple autoloader. I've written us an autoloader. It's super awesome. So the way it works is it basically says, take this class name, which is going to come in with a namespace, and convert all backslashes to forward slashes, and then look for that file. How simple is that? So if I pass in my app template engine loader here, it's going to come in with backslashes, my app template engine loader, and I'm going to say replace all backslashes with forward slashes, and then tell me that that file exists. If it does, include it. Boom. So we've said that since the namespace matches the folder, that's the standard, autoloading is very easy, very reliable, predictable, and you know how to debug your system. You know where every class in Drupal is because it follows this standard. Yes?
Why isn't this just built into the tool?
It's a choice. So basically PHP is, it's old and it's grown a lot in the sense to where it started, literally it was a templating engine. That was its very first thing. And it's grown into a programming language. And the more it grows and the older it gets, the more they want it to be a real, by someone standard programming language. And so this is just, so namespaces are late to the game. I think PHP 5.3 introduced namespaces. And since it's late, it's not naturally built in. And since apps already exist for a dozen years, instead of saying this is how it must work, they say, here's how it should work, do this yourself. And that's where the PHP FIG, the working group who decides these standards, that's the approach they take. It's like, what we're going to do is we're going to talk and debate about different specifications, and then we're going to pick one, together, using members from the Drupal community, WordPress community, Laravel, Symfony. All of us will come together and we'll agree upon a standard. And that standard will be a document that is specifications. And the fourth one, I guess the fifth one, because they started at 0, they're a bunch of nerds. The fifth one they came up with is the PSR4 autoloading. Namespace equals folders. All right. Oh, look, we walked through it. Here we go. So I instantiate template engine autoloader. It comes in like this. The class name here, that class variable, looks like this. Then I say turn that backslash into a forward slash and tell me if that file exists in that folder. And that's PSR4 autoloading. Okay, so let me stop. Any more questions? Because we're going to talk about Composer next, just a little bit. All right. So Composer is a package manager, so command line tool that you use to essentially define the dependencies of your app, and you can also define some other special things about your app. But primarily, let's stick with the concept that it's going to define a whole bunch of different packages that your application uses. For example, the Twig templating engine. So if I made an app whose only requirement was that the Twig templating engine is brought in, then this is what my composer.json file would look like. And I would type composer install inside the same folder this is in, and it would go download Twig for me and put it into a directory. Roughly what Composer is. So it does and also you can start new projects. Since it's a command line tool, I can add new requirements using command line. I can say Composer require guzzle http:/guzzle, and it will go download. It'll go download that to the vendor's directory and also add it to my composer.json file. There's a bit more to it, but Composer is useful. and we're going to get into why right now. So Composer will actually build an autoloader for you. So you tell Composer all the different apps you want. It'll go download, or all the different dependencies or requirements for your app. It'll go download them. It will put them in a vendor folder, and it will generate a file called autoload.php for you inside that vendor folder. And so all your app has to do is require once vendor autoload.php, and everything that you've downloaded, you've told Composer is a requirement, is automatically set up, ready to autoload into your app. And here's a simple example. So this is index.php. I say, Composer install this file, and it does that. It downloads it to a vendor folder. And then I say, new twig loader file system. And since I have Composer's generated autoloader, that's it. I don't have to require every single twig file. I don't have to write my own autoloader. I am ready to start using every single dependency I've defined. Any questions here? So here's what the folder looks like. Here is my app, index.php. Here's my composer.json file. When I said Composer install, it went and downloaded everything to this vendor folder. It generated this autoload file. And there in my index.php, I just said, whoops, include that autoload file. So Composer just made our life very easy for us. Yeah. No, it's not. It's a little. No, it's outside of it.
Okay, so it should be in the.
No, that's just what. No, if you imagine this is not there, then it makes sense. See, autoload is inside the vendor. It's just confusing. PHP Storm screenshot.
What's the definition?
Vendor is just a word that they chose to put dependencies in. Basically, vendor means these packages are provided by another vendor. I did not write these packages. Yeah. So that's kind of like why they use the word vendor. But yeah, so I don't know. I don't think there's, I'm sure they agreed on it for some reason, probably because some other programming language does the same thing. I don't know why that's the common word for where you put other people's code, but it is. So if you can find lots of projects throughout the world that have a vendor folder, which just means other people's code. And source is the common word, or sort of common concept that people use to mean my code. So my code will go in source, other people's code will go in vendor. And that's very standard throughout programming. Okay, so what does PSR4 mean to Drupal? Hey, I said the word Drupal. We're almost talking about Drupal now. So Drupal leverages Composer's automatically generated PSR4 file with some slight modifications that we'll talk about. But basically, since Drupal adopted PSR4 in Drupal 8, that is what lets us bring all of these other libraries into Drupal. Before, you could, but it was done in sort of a roundabout way using the libraries module and basically manually including a bunch of files. But in Drupal 8, we've moved towards the standard, the PSR4. So we're getting off the island and we're starting to play with everybody else now. So you can import Laravel, Laravel sort of stuff made for Laravel that follows PSR4 into Drupal. And that's why we can bring Symfony stuff into Drupal. So we are now agreeing to the PSR4 standard.
Is WordPress?
No. WordPress, no. So in Drupal 7, you could autoload stuff if you wrote it yourself. In Drupal 8, since they did a complete rewrite, basically, they said from the ground up, we're going to adhere to the standard. So what that means in WordPress, you can still import, you can still follow PSR4 within your custom plugin or however you want. I think there's a WP packages that lets you use Composer for WordPress. But until they rewrite it from the ground up, it won't be their standard. It would be more like an option a developer can choose.
Yeah, you like it,
No, they're just making a new editor. I don't think they'll ever rewrite it. What they'll do is they'll prop it up and they'll put some shims under it until it's a house of shims. But hey, it works. That's not good or bad. It's just how, it's a different philosophy. In fact, you could say it's good because they haven't, because they have the most users out of any CMS. So Drupal's file system is a little different, and I got a better slide than this. But Drupal core libraries that aren't a part of any Drupal modules live in the core folder, lib folder, Drupal. Drupal modules live in core modules, module name. Dependencies that aren't created by Drupal live in a vendor folder. And custom modules for your site live in a modules folder. And Drupal has some code where it modifies the autoload, what do you call it, like detection? There's a word for that, it's not detection, discovery. So Drupal does a little bit of dynamic discovery of files for the autoloader, depending on how you're calling it. But after this source folder, in this case, and in this case, and after this Drupal folder, it follows the PSR standard of namespace equal folder name. And here's some examples. So let's look at what's a good one? So Drupal core lives in the import lib. So block base. The top level Drupal class is like a helper class, just full of a bunch of shortcuts to other methods. But since it lives here at the top, it is actually found literally at the top of that folder. Drupal core field formatters. Since it starts with Drupal core, it's in core lib Drupal field formatter base. And so here we have a module named Drupal REST plugin resource base. So it's in the modules folder, the module name source plugin resource base. Should have highlighted some of this. I guess here's what I want you to see. This is a class name, and it matches the folder name at the end.
There's no, the namespace for the modules is not Drupal/modules, it's just Drupal/REST.
It's Drupal. REST is the module name, and I continue my practice of bad examples.
It's assuming the module.
Yeah. Yes. So basically, Drupal's autoloader takes into special. Generally, it follows the PSR4, but it takes into special consideration the differences in where it wants to put its library files versus where it wants to put its module files versus where you might put your own custom module files. And the point of this is that it's not extremely valuable, except for the sense to where if you sort of remember this, and you don't have to memorize it, but if you read it once, and then you see some random class within Drupal, you can know exactly where that class is in the file system.
Go back to the other slide. How would I know that REST is in the modules and not in the vendors or one of those other non-core?
Because it's got a lowercase r. So that's a module name. This is a bad example is what I meant. So this pattern is actually matching this module names. Let me see if the next slide's better. This is a little better. 2 slides later. So here I actually tell you what the pattern looks like. Just a better slide all around. And we can follow it a little better. So core modules are found here. So Drupal little b, which is the module name, and then directory class. Drupal module name directory class. So if it's core, it looks here in the core modules block source folder. If it's contributed, meaning you've included it on your site as a special module, still following this pattern name, which is always lowercase, which is the dead giveaway. Really, that lowercase right there means that this is something in a module. So if it's contributed, it'll just search for it here. Modules contrib flag, source entity flag. And what I've done before, which I thought was pretty useful, is after this sort of section, I'm going to just randomly look in Drupal at a file, and y'all are going to guess the namespace for that file. Yes. Always use lowercase for module names. Yes. Yeah. Really what's happening is chances are it's actually looking at both places. I'm not positive about that, but basically this sort of prefix is what Drupal is going to tell Drupal where to look, and then the rest is folder structure within the module. I was sort of limited by space here, but you could have a module with a namespace, or a class with a namespace this long. And as long as it matches the actual folder that that file lives in, you're good to go. So, yeah, so that's the standard, is that class names, folder names that match namespaces, classes, interface names, all of that's capitalized. And really what it is it's capital case. So it's not it's not capitalized in the sense to where, like, you know, a normal word, just the first letter is capitalized, but it's capital case or title case, where the first letter of each word is capitalized. Camel case starts with a lowercase. Yeah, but so this is called title case, I think. So here's a function inside of Drupal where it's dynamically adjusting the autoloader to find module files. And I thought this might be useful. So behind the scenes, it's taking a module file name. So you can imagine this is like the autoloader. And it's saying for the module name, we expect the namespace to start with Drupal module name, the directory, which is really the module name again, and inside the source folder of that module. This is what's telling your custom module, this is what's telling the autoloader to look inside the source folder within your custom module. And this is inside of, it's like Drupal lib composer or something. It's just part of what Drupal's doing behind the scenes to help the autoloader find your classes. Oh yeah, we looked at that one. Oh, and that's the last one. So I'll just say, any questions before I show some examples of, yes?
Go back to the slide where you did the dependency injection.
Oh, here?
Yeah, so that class needs to go to the file system. Is it like standard to have like class name, like no, not class name, that's in it. It's in it. Will come with dependency injection.
I'm sorry, which part?
So you know, like the new to go to the file system.
Yes.
That's a class name.
Yes, this is the class.
Okay, so is it like standard, like, oh, if it's in the, if you dependency injection create, then you'll know that class is coming up with its dependency injection.
So this isn't the use of dependency injections kind of throwing me there. Do you mean?
Well, in the composer file that you completed.
Right. Yeah. So I get what I'm showing here is that since I'm using Composer's autoloader, actually in this example, twig is just in the global namespace, so I didn't have to use it at all. You mean like, are you asking why I don't have the use keyword here, or?
Well, I just wonder like, oh, is it like standard like all the classes?
No, what it is that twig 1.x is made to work in PHP 5.3, and so another bad example. This is like what old class names look like, and that's why it looks like that. If I had included twig 2x, I believe it is much more like namespaces and backslashes. So to do, fix that example. But it would be more like load new twig / twig / loader file system or something similar to that. I'm not sure why I used the 1x example here. Did that answer your question?
Sort of.
Okay. Do you want me to try again? Sorry about that. So any other questions? Like what I need here is a takeaway screen, and the takeaway is that autoloading means automatically pulling classes into your app without you having to require a class file. Namespaces are relating different classes to each other. If your namespaces match your folder structure, you've adhered to the PSR4 standard, and you are welcome into the PHP community as something that is interoperable between different PHP applications. And I have some examples. So I can show these and share these. So I actually wrote a bunch of little examples for each of these things. Is there one of those? So these are two concepts: autoloading and namespaces. Glue them together, and you have a third concept, PSR4. Is there one of those that anybody has any questions on or wants to see an example of, more in depth? Make sense? I hope that means it makes sense. Okay, and using Composer to build it for you, so you can use Composer to actually write an autoloader for your own custom code, which I've done here. And this is just in my Composer file. And it said Composer, provide an autoloader matching the PHP PSR4 standard. And everything that's prefixed with the name Jonathan will be found in the source directory. And so I have all my calculator stuff, namespace, Jonathan, math, whatnot. And you see it's in a math folder. So that when I call Jonathan, math, whole number calculator, the autoloader knows to look inside the source folder because it starts with Jonathan, inside the math folder because that's part of the namespace, for the whole number calculator.php file. And that is autoloading plus namespaces, adhering to PSR4, leveraging Composer, and this is how Drupal does it.
That's how you guide
Yep, it's why you'll never find in the Drupal code base include once some file, is because it's all happening behind the scenes. Yeah. It's nice. So I think that's that. So